hello to everybody. I'm Susanna Carman. If you're happy to unmute your video, that would be great because it enables me to see you and connect with you. I mean, it's challenging enough when we're in this two-dimensional space, but it makes it much more human if we can see each other. So I really want to extend that invitation to everybody. Makes it easier to present to. Yay, people, live, breathing human beings, wonderful. Fantastic. So yes, I'm Susanna Carman. I call myself a strategic designer. I consider myself a research practitioner in that space. I work specifically at the intersection of design, leadership, and learning. I deliver consulting, facilitation, design, and coaching services. And I work with consultancies and individual practitioners who are themselves delivering design and change services to others. And sometimes that means I'm actually working inside large systems doing leader development, design, and delivery with executives in the public health sector space and some other spaces as well. I guess I can add, just by way of introduction, that I'm also the founder and lead facilitator of something called Transition Leadership Lab, which is a 9-week learning lab for design practitioners and practitioners of change who already have a sophisticated set of tools and mindset and still feel these are insufficient to meet the challenge of leading change processes in an increasingly complex world. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that and be introducing some frameworks that we take a much deeper dive into that program with others throughout today's presentation session. Let's see, a few other things about me. I am a wife and a mother. I have a 15-year-old daughter. I live in northern New South Wales, Australia. And I do the work I do because I'm committed to developing leaders, particularly designers who are leading processes, because I feel like we have a very significant role to play in the world that's being shaped right now. Because I feel like, you know, I want to participate in cultivating a more sophisticated, wiser group of leaders that have the maturity to respond masterfully, you know, as we're trying to face increasingly complex, uncertain conditions in the world that we're living in and the circumstances we're designing for. So that's me. And what I'd like to do is invite everybody now to go into breakout rooms where you'll be set up as pairs so that you can actually introduce yourselves to one another. And I've asked Sarah to pop a little instruction in the chat right now. So the question we would like you to use as the prompt for introducing yourselves to one another is, what would you like to tell me, that is the person you're speaking to, what would you like to tell me about the level of complexity you encounter in your work life? So we'll revisit some of what was shared and captured halfway through the session. And now I'm just going to start sharing my screen just to set up some expectations around the purpose of today's session and what you can all expect to get out of it. So here I go. Yeah, so the title of today's session is Holistic Design, a Framework for Collective Sense Making. And what I'm going to be doing is really talking about, you know, what do I mean by holistic design? Why does it matter? Why is it important? Why would using a holistic tool as design practitioners be important? I'm also going to introduce the feature holistic tool today, which is called the Integral Framework. I'll be offering a bit more interactive learning through another activity, and then we'll do some completion activity. I'll also share a little bit more about Transition Leadership Lab, because some of you might want to take a deeper dive into the framework that I'm introducing today, and we do that in the lab, and I make myself available for individual discovery sessions for anybody who wants to learn more about that. So I'm going to kick us off with a little bit of a collective inquiry session before I start presenting more content. And I'm just going to ask the question, when you look at this, what do you see? And feel free to pop in some responses in the chat, and Sarah can maybe read some of those out loud. I can't really see the chat with ease while I'm facilitating and see everybody else at the same time. So just
awesome. So Shan mentions a corner of a painting. We've got colors and textures popping up. Beachside vibes, cardboard.
Fantastic. Okay.
Wind, yeah.
And what about now? What do you see now?
This reminds me of like autumn, personally, with the leaves potentially. Paint strokes, flowers.
Beautiful. And now?
Blossoms. This one's a bit more chaotic, abstract. Feet, grasses, wind. My child's art, hay, tiger.
Fantastic. Okay. And now?
I think I see an arm personally. Yeah, arm. Yeah, consensus. Dancer's arm, blurry arm.
With a watch or a bracelet on or something.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So what I'm trying to do here is provide a definition of how I think about holistic thinking. And sometimes holistic thinking and systems thinking get used interchangeably, but I'm going to say, I'm just going to put it out there, holistic thinking as sort of a broader category of conceptual thought. And I have this little definition here, seeing both the parts and the whole. The practice of both zooming in and zooming out to see the patterns that emerge when we make visible multiple dimensions of reality and the interdependencies that allow us to take meaningful, pragmatic action. So, holistic thinking, you can look at this full painting of the Degas dancer, and you could look at each square and think about this as 4 separate squares where there's content information in each square. You could think about this as, 4 different spaces on a whole. So you can think about it like a heuristic, like this is happening and it's partially happening. It's the partial picture of the whole that you see once you zoom out. And then you can also think about them as a system. And this is maybe where people more think about systems thinking. There are interdependencies, relationships, patterns that are starting to emerge that when you probe and discover them, you can start to make linkages. And as designers, our practice is to zoom in, capture the detail, see the brush stroke and the texture of the medium, and then also to zoom out and see the whole. And so that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying holistic thinking. And holistic thinking becomes really important, I believe. I'm arguing that in the world we're living in a world where there's just what I would call a time of transition, or what Zach Stein, who's a futurist and academic, calls a time between worlds. Cultivating, I'm arguing that cultivating holistic thinking and using tools that invite our ability to think this way and then gives us the expressive capacity to talk about it and the receptive capacity for other people to understand what it is to zoom out, zoom in, see multiplicity, synthesize ideas, come together in that way, that this is really imperative. And the way I'm going to describe why it matters is by sharing a story about the context and conditions that we're all designing inside of, that we're trying to understand the problems we're designing for and the types of solutions we're coming up with. So I'll just tell the story. I call it living in a time between worlds, feeling the pull of the future, the push of the present, and the drag of the past simultaneously, and in a way that is generating unprecedented disruption. And I would argue that this disruption is due to the convergence of 3 transformative forces: an economic force, an ecological force, and a cultural force. The economic force has these 3 component parts. The first is the coming together of artificial intelligence and robotics. The second is shifting global demographics and what the impact that is on culture, diversity, shared values, resilience. And also the third part is the sharing economy, where there's value being traded between parties without an intermediary needed to determine what that value is. And we see that in distributed ledger systems and in other platforms. And it's all 3 of these things are very disruptive to business as usual. I could spend days talking about this, but I need to keep moving. The second force is an ecological one, often referred to as the Anthropocene, anthro meaning human, pocene referring to a chunk of geologic time. Anthro is relevant because we know that human behavior is impacting the biospheric structure of the planet. We know this to be true because sea level is rising, our climate is changing, and we're experiencing the largest mass extinction in 65 million years. And some would argue, like Joe Brewer, who is like a cultural evolutionist, that as we shift focus or shift our attention and our activities from natural systems to socially constructed ones, we create a lot more variability and novelty in the systems we're working in. And, you know, one could argue that viruses are included in that novelty, and hence the pandemic and its consequences is part of this ecological shift. Again, I could speak about this for hours, but I'll keep moving. The third force is what I would call a cultural force. It's the tension between a reductionist and pluralistic way of seeing the world. So when I talk about reductionist way of seeing the world, I'm talking about this idea that truth is objective, it's empirical, it's measurable, it's really, this way of thought came online post-Enlightenment. In a cultural sense, there's a singular narrative about the unfolding story of humanity, which has primarily been told from an Anglo-European perspective. When I'm talking about pluralistic worldview, I'm talking about this idea that truth is subjective, it is experiential, it is phenomenological. There are as many truths as there are people experiencing life, and that there's multiple stories about the unfolding narrative of humanity, and all of those stories need to be included. All of those voices are valid and need to be shared and understood in order to make meaning of who we are and make sense of the world around us. And the argument is that both of these ways of seeing the world have both positive and negatives. Neither on their own are sufficient to meet the challenge of all three of these forces converging. And so I just have a couple of images here. This is one somewhere in Scandinavia in 1969, where many people are standing outside a public location, electronic store, where they're all watching a TV tell one story about the lunar landing, versus the world we live in today, where we're all in our own stories, in our own narratives, perhaps reinforcing the biases we hold about ourselves and about how we make meaning of the world around us. And that's just a metaphor for the tension between those two ways of seeing the world. So I would say then that when these three forces converge, they are amplifying a set of conditions that are naturally occurring in life generally, but are really pumped up. One that's known as VUCA, the acronym VUCA, and it has these four component parts. Increased volatility, where challenges are unexpected, things are unstable, and the speed of change forces rapid iteration. Uncertainty, where there's a lack of predictability, there's an inability to rely on past experiences to direct future action. Complexity, a multitude of events, convergence of issues without direct cause and effect relationships. And ambiguity, an open to multiple interpretations with no clear way to make meaning of events. And I'm arguing that when these conditions are alive, our traditional, more conventional, more empirical, more linear, logical ways of understanding and solving problems are no longer fit for purpose. Some other kind of toolkit and mindset needs to be brought to the fore in order for us to be able to understand challenges and solve for these challenges as designers when VUCA conditions are amplified in a time between worlds. So I'm going to lean into this idea of, well, how do you know what sort of challenge you're actually responding to? And I'm going to talk about two different types of challenges. So one is what I would call a technical challenge or a technical problem, where the problem is clear, an analytical solution is within the current expertise, and if you apply the solution, the problem is solved. And sometimes this can be referred to as like hammer meets nail, where you keep seeing things as technical and applying technical solutions, regardless of actually what the nature of the problem is or how much VUCA is present in the scenario. So this sort of phrase here, the problem is when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I'm contrasting that with a different type of challenge, what Ron Heifetz refers to as adaptive challenge, where the causes lie in internal and intangible aspects of human life, beliefs, feelings, and values. Solutions do not lie in what worked in the past. We require adaptation and evolution, and there's a requirement for transformation of the way we think, our values, the strategies we use, and the methods we use. And it's helpful to return to the challenge of climate change, which has been treated kind of like a technical problem, where if we just demonstrate the science and provide evidence, we can make the change that's needed. But what we realize is those technical problems actually sit inside of a larger adaptive challenge, because a lot of what we're talking about around change is around behavioral change. And that has to do with the way humans interact, what they believe, the myths and narratives they tell, the values they share. It's much more complex. It's an adaptive challenge. And here's another example of that, when both adaptive and technical challenges are present. This is an image of Deepwater Horizon, where the BP oil platform exploded in the Gulf of Mexico back in 2010. And here we can see that, yes, there were technical challenges or technical problems that were a part of why this happened, but it was happening inside of an adaptive challenge, where things having to do with decision-making and information flows and hierarchies and the way people communicate and relate to one another had a profound impact on this actually taking place. So many adaptive challenges include technical elements. Effective responses require a combination of known technical solutions and evolving human elements. So with that in mind, I'd just like to show this slide, which I love this slide, and I'm sure many of you have seen this before, this idea of this giant elephant, and people are so zoomed in and so in a silo in their thinking, and they're so certain that their perspective is right. So this idea of perspectives and the role perspectives play when you're trying to see the whole picture, and the limitations that our perspectives, our individual perspectives have when we're actually trying to see a fuller picture. And it's this idea that everyone is right, but only partially right. Our own perspective is limited. There are cognitive biases that shape our perception, and we construct our reality. So just this Barnum effect around bias. We construct plausible truths from partial information. Confirmation bias. We look for what we already believe to be true. Anchoring bias. The first thing you judge influences your judgment of all that follows. Self-serving bias. Believe failures are due to external factors. Success is due to personal attributes. And we all do this, either all of these things or some of these things, but this is alive. It's part of the human condition. So what? So how do we respond? How do we kind of come up with a mechanism for countering our bias, and also being able to, zoom in and see the detail of the texture of the elephant's skin, but zoom out far enough to see that what we're looking at is an elephant. So this is where I'd like to introduce the framework that I want to work with today. It's called the integral framework. It comes from the work of 21st century philosopher and deep thinker Ken Wilber. It has 4 different elements. It's 4 fundamental perspectives alive simultaneously. It helps us recognize parts and wholes. It helps us see connections between factors. It helps us look for patterns over time. It helps us notice movements in one part of the system that impact on other parts. So we're kind of shifting from very logical, linear, if-then ways of mapping and understanding systems to something that invites what we call a multi-perspectival view of a scenario, situation, or challenge. And its applications sit in this ability to coordinate multiple perspectives, to highlight bias and blind spots, to diagnose adaptive challenges, to make sense of complex systems, to identify vicious cycles and virtuous loops. So vicious cycles are when we're kind of in patterns of behavior that are repetitive, that produce outcomes that nobody wants, versus a virtuous loop where we start to intervene in vicious cycles and we can change the pattern to start creating outcomes that we do want. And then this design of experiments to nudge and create ripples. So let me just share a little bit about this framework. This framework has several different hemispheres. So we're just going to look at the top hemisphere and the bottom hemisphere first. In the top hemisphere, we're working at the realm of the individual. And in the bottom hemisphere, we're looking at the realm of the collective. On the left-hand side, we're looking at subjective truth or subjective experience. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at objective experience. So subjective, the interiority of either the individual or the group or the collective, and objective, what we can observe, see, and measure that's external to us, both either in terms of individual behaviors or collective systems. So if we start to think of them now as 4 different dimensions of reality that are simultaneously occurring, we've got mindsets in the first person, what I would call the I, the individual I. So what are my values, my mindsets, my attitudes, my worldview, my self-awareness, my motivations, and my emotional intelligence? Another dimension of reality that's at play is in the objective of the individual around our behaviors or our actions. The skills I have, the capacities I have, the behaviors I exhibit, the physical actions that I take, and individual performance. Now down here in the lower left quadrant of culture or we, or that sort of collective intersubjective space, sometimes referred to as the intersubjective, what's going on between us in this interior collective space. So things like shared values, relationships, group norms, team morale, networks, and culture. And over here, excuse me, is this objective side of the external, of the collective. So things like our systems, which includes our structures, our policies and procedures, our organizational charts, our infrastructure, our environment, and our finances. So as I said earlier, well, I'll just say, I'll also add here this language of I for mindset at the individual level, it for the behaviors that are outside of me at the individual level, we for the collective intersubjective, and it's plural for the collective interobjective. So this is very jargon laden. I can understand that it's a lot of language, but I'm just really introducing you to the possibility that we can create a mapping mechanism for seeing these multiple perspectives simultaneously and mapping them and including them in how we understand a challenge and how we might explore a solution to that challenge. The assumption is if we're looking at all four of these dimensions simultaneously, we will generate more sustainable understanding and sustainable solutions in response to the challenge we're recognizing. So we could think of these as four different, just like with the Degas picture, we can think of these as four different separate buckets or categories. You could think of them as true and partially true. So it's like, you know, maybe you're mapping or the leader in that space or the collective focus of that space is all around culture and we, and that's the only lens through which a challenge is being reviewed. It's really good to know that, yeah, the data you glean from that perspective is true and partially true. That's what we call a heuristic. So it's true and partially true. Or you might start to think of how these might be interdependent. What's the relationship between my inner mindset and my outer behavior? Or what's the relationship between a society's shared values and the laws and governance structures that they embed in their institutions to reflect those values? And you start to see that, you know, they move across these four dimensions as well. So I'm just introducing that framework as a real holistic mechanism for making sense of what's going on in a system. And you may already be working with tools as designers that enable you to do this. It's just when you move from practitioner to actually leading more complex design processes, being able to take this holistic big picture view becomes an essential mindset, and we need tools to help us do that. We become the illuminator, we become the synthesizer, we become the narrative teller when we're trying to bring multiple perspectives together in our role as leading design processes, as opposed to being the practitioner doing focused work inside of a design process. So here, as I'm getting us ready to move into another activity, and I'm just going to check the time. Okay, so what I want to say here is that these are some questions that help us analyze a situation or an issue when we're either doing research or testing a prototype. That's the outcome of a real clear how might we question. So you can be using this in the first diamond or the second diamond. I'm making an assumption that people are familiar with the double diamond model here associated with either design thinking or human-centered design. And so questions in that mindset dimension are around things that relate to an individual's psychological influences on a situation. And let me just clarify something actually before I dive in. When you're doing some data capture and synthesizing, you want to clarify the unit of analysis that you're exploring. So maybe it is just one individual person, like perhaps if you're working in the field of psychology or counseling, you want to do a holistic review of an individual or a holistic intake process to understand the full complex multi-perspectival view of what's happening for an individual. But the unit of analysis could also be a team. It could also be a customer set. It could be a whole organization, or it could be society. So once you determine the unit of analysis that you're exploring or doing research or designing for, that's very helpful to create some clarity in the research process. And then you can start diving in. So, why is the issue important to either me or them, depending on the unit of analysis? What is my or their motivation? What is the attitude? What do I or they value? And some other questions over here in the behavioral domain around individual behavior influencing a situation. What behavior is a hindrance? What behavior is helpful? What knowledge, skill, capabilities are being shown? What are the gaps? What skill development is required? What actions are needed? What behaviors need to change? In the culture dimension around collective cultural relational influences on a situation, what power, political, or relationship dynamics are contributing to the scenario? What group norms of behavior are at play? Are they helping or hindering? What about shared or conflicting cultural values, beliefs, assumptions, paradigms, and worldviews? And over in the systems dimension around collective structural influences on a situation, what systems or processes are contributing to the issue? What are the environmental, economic, infrastructure issues at play? What new or adjusted structures or systems need to be put in place? So I'm just sharing this with all of you so you could start to see that having a holistic tool to understand a scenario within a complex challenge is really helpful for you as the researcher, but also when you go to share your insights back to those with whom you're trying to cultivate the receptive capacity to see a holistic perspective on a challenge. Again, linking that to the assumption when we do this, we create more sustainable, more enduring solutions. So I'm going to invite everyone to take a photograph of the screen right now while it's up there. And then we're going to move into an activity again. So I just want to check in and ask a few questions. The first is, you can either write something in the chat or feel free to pop up and speak right now. I just want to let people, popcorn their ideas vocally into the space. What did you discover in that conversation based on what I was asking you to explore? Anything interesting pop up? There were elements of the model I hadn't thought to ask about. There's not one dominating quadrant. Great. I'll just say while you're all thinking, when I did the opening and shared about myself, I talked a lot about the upper right quadrant, the work I do. And then I tried to throw in a few things. Oh, I'm a mother and I'm a wife and I have a daughter and here's what I stand for. Here's my purpose in the world. So I was trying to bring a little bit of the upper left in, but most of what I talked about in introducing myself was about what I do. Right? What I do in the world. And I feel like we often are relating to each other like that. And that's the data we're capturing about one another. But there's so much more going on, right? Anybody else have anything they want to contribute to that? Something they noticed either about, okay, there were bits from each quadrant, but a couple were more dominant. 5 minutes isn't enough to get a full picture. Agreed. That's right. And when we're in the research phase, we know we have to really allocate time and resource to capture information. And also, that whole thing of, information that provides outlier data, maybe most of the data you capture is in one quadrant and suddenly you get all this information in another one. How do you bring that in and synthesize that and help tell the bigger story of what's going on? I think time pressure shapes those responses. Yeah. Great. The deliberate nature of the lenses helped give a much more rounded picture. Yeah. So it reminds me when I'm doing research to formulate questions in each quadrant so that I'm actually getting a holistic review of what's going on. And then it reminds me when I'm developing a solution, like sometimes the solution, it has me go, oh, all of the solutions everyone's coming up with are in the lower right quadrant around structures and systems and protocols, and right? And it's like, wait a minute, maybe the solution's someplace else. Like maybe there's something around shared values that need to be considered. So it's a reminder to look in those other spaces, to look for themes. Maybe there's something going on in the upper right quadrant that's informing the lower right quadrant. So that's that sort of systems thinking piece. But unless you're seeing it all, it's very easy. Often people go straight to the lower right-hand quadrant and go, the solution's there, or straight to the upper right-hand quadrant and go, the solution's there. But actually there's all this data in these other dimensions. It reminds me of the water systems of change model. Is it based off of what? So I'm not sure if that's being, are you asking a question there, or are you referring to the model in your question?
Yeah, sorry, the model, integral model framework reminds me of the water systems of change model, and I was wondering if it's based off of the same one or one of them informed the other.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I know Ken Wilber developing the integral framework comes from what I was talking about before, like the subjective truth and the objective truth. And there's been a debate since, like, the origins, like early Greek philosophy. What's true? No, what we can measure and see is true, and that becomes the physical sciences. No, what we experience inside ourselves, that's what's true, and that becomes sort of theosophy and religiosity, in the sort of, I guess before the rational age, the sort of between 0 to like the 1700s, that really dominated that sort of inner perspective. So it's both. And his developing that model comes out of that tradition of philosophy. Like, actually, how do we have rather than an either or argument about what's true, how do we create a both and discussion about what's true and start working on synthesis and looking for patterns, which is more indicative of systems thinking. How does time influence sense making using the framework? As in, when should one say we're done sense making? Beautiful question. I'm not going to give you an answer. I just think that's a really great question. When should one say we're done sense making? I mean, I guess I could say in the design school of thought, you have this sort of divergence, convergence, polarity, and a professor once said to me, when you've captured everything you possibly can and you've done all the research you possibly can and you've got all the detail you possibly need, you've spent too much time in divergence. You should have converged earlier. So it is a bit of a tango, right? And it's a little bit of an art too. It's like, when do I make that move? I guess the other question, there's more stuff coming up in the chat, but the next question I have is, when you reflect on the tools you're using, do the tools you're using, and I guess this relates a little bit to what you were sharing, Ara, do the tools you're using already take a holistic perspective, or do you notice that some of the tools you're using to map and the canvases you're using as well, are they sitting in any one quadrant? Just wondering if the tools we're using have a bias in any one quadrant. Anybody have thoughts about that? Oh, there's a hand.
Yeah, I'm just like reflecting on the practice of UX. Like, a lot of times we're talking about, I guess, like behavioral design and stuff like that, thinking about how to address certain cognitive biases or how people find things. That's kind of like, from my understanding, working with the individual psychological influence of the situation. Maybe a little bit on the second quadrant, like the behavior and stuff like that. But so that's what I see in a lot of the classic kind of like UX practice, focusing on the top two. But then I think about design thinking, but that probably sometimes kind of sit more with a culture and system level, or, like design on a even bigger scale, like design, say like service design or design of an organization or design for change. I guess that has to kind of work more on the culture and the system front. Yeah, just some quick reflection.
Yeah, interesting observation. Fantastic. And I'm looking in the chat, a lot of behavioral focus. It's just great to start making visible where the biases are in the tools we're using, and maybe even connecting different biases to different subdisciplines within design. And, if you're moving from practitioner to leader, maybe our role is, well, how do we start synthesizing the best of all these different subdisciplines when we're actually trying to understand a challenge? What might that do for our practice? What might that do for building an understanding and a capacity to develop more holistic solutions? So I'm just going to land it there, because I know we're in the last 2 minutes, and this is such a rich conversation. It can go in a lot of different directions. I'm just going to ask Sarah to post in the chat. Look, if you're interested in taking a much deeper dive into the space, I do run this transition leadership lab. As I said at the beginning, it's nine weeks long. We explore this within the context of developing and enhancing our own capacity to lead amidst complexity, that as designers, many of us are being called to step into roles of leading design processes. And what do we have to access inside of ourselves in order to do that masterfully? And really take into account this piece around a strategy is one thing, but actually the relational space of being and engaging with other people as we develop design with and lead with is a real challenge. It is an adaptive challenge. So the lab is about that. And if you want to learn more, you can contact me directly. You could visit the website. You could book a discovery session with me. I do one-on-one private discovery sessions with people who want to learn more to see if it's the right match to support them. And I also see here that there's a bit of a, Sarah, were you inviting people to fill out a feedback form?
Yep, so it's the first bullet point in that message, and I can repop it in the chat. Also, when I send out my thank you email later this week, I'll include all those links as well and encourage you guys to submit some feedback.
Yeah, great. And I'm just mentioning the lab because the next cohort starts January 16th, 2023. So I'm inviting people to have conversations with me to see if it'll support them in their practice and in their work. So it was just lovely. I know that's just a quick snapshot. I want to honor time commitment and end on time. It was great to work with you all. There's so much more that could be said about this space. I wish you all the best in your work and personal lives, and that you have a happy and healthy break over the holiday season. So best wishes to you all, and thanks for joining us today.